this morning.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate it. Thank you for coming out and for such a good breakfast. That was fantastic. Well, we're going to jump in and talk about running the race of faith. My question for you is, you ever been tempted in your life and at a point where you're going to quit something that's important to you? Maybe a job, maybe a marriage, maybe your faith. Now, there is a time to quit and move on from certain things in life, but there's also time to stay and bear it through. Why are we seeing this spate of so many young people who grow up in the church no longer running the race of faith? If you follow these stories in the news, they're stories of former worship leaders, former authors, kind of big-name pastors. But also, if we went around the room, probably some of our own friends, maybe our own family members. Maybe this is something very personal for us as well. What can we learn from the scriptures about how to keep running the race of faith well? Tomorrow, we're going to talk about specifically how do we pass on that faith to the next generation. But on this theme of months, as you are asking those questions, I thought this might be interesting. If you're born between December and March, stand up. So if your birthday is December, January, February, or March, stand up. Now, there's a range of different statistics about how many young people disengage the church. But if you look around, roughly those standing represent the number of those on a conservative estimate who will disengage the church through high school, into college, and beyond. I mean, just look around. That puts a personal face on. Now, you can have a seat. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody who disengages the church becomes an atheist, and some, in fact, come back. But many don't. Many don't. So how can we think about this and maybe be more effective in keeping our own faith and helping others run the race of faith next to us? Well, we're going to look at a passage that Paul writes from a jail cell to the Philippians. So if anybody had reason to stop running the race of faith, it might be somebody in prison for obvious reasons. And yet Paul doesn't. Why not? Well, if you have your Bibles, you're welcome to open up, or I'll read this for us. It's in the book of Philippians. We're going to look in the letter to the Philippians. If you can't find it, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Philippians. When people don't laugh at that, I get really nervous. Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3, verses 13. Philippians 3, verses 13. And I'm going to read the second part of verse 13 through 4, verse 1, because it kind of goes together as a section, then we'll unpack this a little bit. And then, by the way, when we're done, we'll open up for just questions and thoughts that you might have about this. Philippians 3, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. For many of whom I have often told you now, tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction, their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with their minds set on earthly things. Verse 20, but our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Then 4, verse 1 says, therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. So why do people quit running the race of faith? One reason I think Paul hits at is evil and suffering, pain and hurt. There's a well-known evangelist, if I mention his name, most of you would know who he is. Roughly a contemporary to my father, and his son became an evangelist as well, and was preaching a message at Biola when I was an undergrad in the mid-90s. And yet maybe a dozen years ago, I got a call from a friend, And he said, hey, do you know this evangelist has left his faith? And he's an atheist. And I sat there. You know how time just stands still? This is someone who profoundly influenced me in my life. It was one of the first stories of somebody I look up to and I admired quit running the race of faith. And it reminds me of this passage, because what does Paul say? He says, for many of whom I've told you now and tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. That how could someone go from being an evangelist to, in a sense, now being an enemy of the Christian faith? Well, it's interesting. As he talked, a few things bubbled to the surface. Number one, he had a problem with the issue of hell, a problem with God's judgment being too harsh. Second, the issue of LGBTQ. He said, how could God call gay people uniquely an abomination? Now, he doesn't, but that's what he said. And third, to be honest with you, he was working in the inner city, and it was the rape of a 9-year-old girl. How could a loving God allow this to happen? How could a loving God allow this to happen? Now, if that doesn't jar us a little bit and make us do some soul searching, I'm not sure we appreciate the level of that question. I'm convinced that the biggest reason people jettison the faith is because of the problem of evil. At the core, we look out the world and say, if God is all powerful, if God is all good, he could stop this, and yet he doesn't. Maybe a better explanation is there is no God. By the way, the problem of evil is everywhere. Debates about gun control is what? About the problem of evil. How do we stop this suffering? The environment, the problem of evil. Immigration. Why is there suffering? The problem of evil. Well, what's interesting in this context is that this is not just an academic question for Paul, is it? Paul personally suffered. And we know the passage. You don't have to turn there, I'll read it to you. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul reads how much he suffered. He says, 5 times I received the hands of the Jews, the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned, and that has nothing to do with smoking pot, just for the record. 3 days I was shipwrecked. A night and day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. So why didn't Paul, if he saw and experienced so much heartache, why does this evangelist bail when he sees it, but Paul doesn't? I think a part of this is Paul knew the cost of following Jesus. He understood this is a broken, fallen world, and sin is real. And it's going to cost us something to follow Jesus. Look, if you signed up for this Christian faith because you want to get something from God, then when you don't get that thing from God, what's going to happen? You're going to abandon your faith. It makes sense. Paul in Acts 9:16, he was told, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. I think sometimes in Christian circles, we want to lower the bar so much to get hands raised to celebrate the number of followers of Jesus that I wonder what gospel they're really committing to. Rather than saying, hey, Paul, welcome to faith. Your life is now going to be easier. Paul was told, you're going to suffer for my name. That was his expectation. So when he suffered, it made sense to him. He didn't expect differently. I was speaking shortly before COVID with my father at an apologetics conference. And if I remember, there's probably 800 or 900 people. It's a huge conference. And the head of it is a friend of mine. He emailed me shortly before, and he said, hey, Sean, just want to give you the heads up that a former youth pastor who was at a huge church in our town, who's left his faith, is willing to come to this conference. He stepped down from his position, no longer believes in God, and he's willing to come to the conference. I said, hey, that's really cool. Do you think he'd be willing to have lunch with me? Not that I want to debate him. I said, just tell him I'd be happy to hear his story. And if I could try to answer any questions, I'd love to try. He says, sure. So my dad and I taught all morning. We had about an hour for lunch. I come in there, and this guy looked like exactly the quintessential youth pastor. Tall, funny, good-looking kid that it's like, hey, give that kid a mic and put him in front of teenagers, right? Hang out with students. His first question was, why isn't God more present and active today? Why don't we experience God like they do in the Bible? Well, as far as I remember, probably 30 or 40 minutes, I did my best to answer his questions. Keep in mind, I teach in an apologetics program. This is my job. And I'm giving him answers. He's been very generous, but I'm sitting there going, God, my answers are really not that great. I am dropping the ball on this one. I just, for whatever reason, didn't feel like I was connecting with him. Got towards the end, probably 40 minutes in, and he said, I really appreciate it. Is there any last thing you would say to me that we didn't cover? And I said, in my experience, when I meet someone who's left the faith, my question is not why did they leave? My question is about when they came in. Can you tell me that moment when you realized you were a sinner and you cried out to God for his grace? It was like a blank stare, like a deer in the headlights. He goes, Sean, I didn't become a Christian because I was a sinner in need of grace. I became a Christian because I was hurting and suffering and told that Jesus would make me feel better. That's a false gospel. And not only did he enter on a false gospel, he taught for years to the next generation without understanding the gospel. I said to him, hey, well, what's keeping you back then? Because ironically, your first question was, why aren't you experiencing God? But if you're not willing to humble yourself and experience his grace, then miracles and supernatural things are not even going to make sense to you. He said, well, I'm afraid what would happen if I go there in my life. Friends, that's a false gospel. He actually thought coming to faith was going to make his life better. That's the opposite of what Paul thought. So no wonder Paul was able to process suffering in his faith, because he understood God is still sovereign, God is still in control, and God is changing lives. I've come to the conviction that many people lead the faith because they have bad theology to start with. That's why good theology is so important. So for Paul, the reason he stayed the faith is because he understood that God was sovereign and that Christians will suffer. In fact, even Peter says in 1 Peter 3 that if it's God's will that we suffer well for doing what is good. But there's a second reason Paul didn't jettison his faith when he suffered. And it's because Paul believed in the resurrection of Jesus. Paul believed that we are on the winning side and the debt has already been paid. Paul believed that. Paul believed, hey, we've already won. It hasn't been realized yet, but we're on the winning team, so setbacks aren't going to set Paul back because he knows who's in control. Now, what's fascinating, this is a whole separate conversation, is I teach one class, you asked me about this yesterday, on the resurrection. And what's interesting is virtually all scholars agree, from the left to the right, Christian to skeptic and critic, that Paul had an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. That Paul is this persecutor and then becomes a great missionary. The question is, what happened in between to change his life? Now, there's a lot of theories. People try to say Paul had schizophrenia or Paul had this. None of them work. We have Paul's testimony. He said he had seen the risen Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15. That's why when Paul says that I may know him and the power of his suffering, what does that mean? That when we suffer, we have solidarity with Christ, who has risen from the grave, and someday we will have the resurrection bodies that Jesus now has. Now, a ton more can be said about evil and suffering. I realize I haven't remotely dealt with all of this. I teach a full class on it. But I think we learn from this passage, and I think we learn right away that one of the big reasons people bail is because of evil and suffering. Because of evil and suffering. Now, the second reason, I think, is this. And you asked me a little about my story yesterday, but there's a part of my story I didn't tell you. Yes, I grew up in a Christian home. My dad worked with Cru as an apologist. So following Jesus made sense to me. But there's a point in my life when I was younger where I just turned my back on Jesus. Thought, you know what, I'm going to live life my own way. Forget the Bible, forget what my parents have taught me, and started heading down this road and realized I could not go any further. And so when I was 4 years old, I got down on my knees. You feel somewhat manipulated, don't you? The reality is I did grow up in a Christian home and always heard these dramatic stories of conversion. And always thought, man, if God's going to use me, I got to come out of prison, and maybe I got to be in a gang or go to war. Like, I always thought these are the dramatic stories because those stories are encouraging. And then when I actually looked at the Bible, it's like there's dramatic stories, but then there's stories of people like Daniel and Joseph who were just faithful throughout their lives. So I'm partly kidding and giving you a hard time. But yesterday, what I shared about having questions gets to the heart of why many people disengage faith. And I'm going to talk about this tomorrow morning. But people don't leave the faith primarily because of doubts. They leave because of unexpressed doubts. What does that mean? It's worth asking, do we create a culture in our families, in our churches, in the Christian community, in which questions are welcomed and invited and taken seriously? I'm not sure we do a great job of that. About a year ago, I invited on a self-proclaimed progressive Christian pastor from San Diego. I don't know if you happen to see this conversation. I've had him on twice. Really nice fellow. He's written some books. His name is Colby Martin. And I invited him on. I said, hey, would you be willing to just have a conversation, comparing and contrasting our experiences? And I want to know what, as a progressive Christian, you believe about things like the resurrection, the deity of Jesus, the authority of Scripture. And as I asked him his story, he grew up and went to an evangelical school, started to have questions about his faith. And what happened? Shot down, not taken seriously, shamed. Over and over and over again. When I talk with people who have deconverted from the faith, a common thread that shows up is that people didn't take my questions seriously. People didn't allow me to have questions. They didn't allow me to doubt. So, by the way, Jude 1:22 says, have mercy on those who doubt. Why? Because doubt can be a painful process. When people doubt, they start to think, what does this mean for my family? What does this mean for my relationships, my future, my identity? Doubts can be emotionally painful. So Jude says, have mercy on those who doubt. You know, doubt is not the opposite of faith, by the way, right? That's why in Matthew 28, at the Great Commission, it says they believed, but some of them what? Some of them doubted. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's when you are, let's say, lack confidence in what you believe and you're not certain about it. But you can believe something and still have some doubts about it. Okay? So why is this important? Well, take the story of Thomas, for example. What do we call Thomas? Doubting Thomas. We need to stop calling him Doubting Thomas. Thomas was not a doubter. What does a doubter say? I'm not sure. I don't know. I have questions. I'm not convinced. What did Thomas say? I will not believe. He rejected it. He didn't doubt it. He rejected it completely. He was not a doubter. So was what Thomas did consistent with belief? No. He flat out said, I won't believe unless I can see and touch. And he sees Jesus, and what happens? Then he's convinced. Thomas was not a doubter. When we talk about Thomas as a doubter, we give the impression that to doubt something is to reject it. So a kid has doubt, they feel like they're fully rejecting it. If they raise questions, they're no better than somebody who says, I will not believe unless I can see and touch. But that's not what most doubters are doing. When a young person says to me they have doubts, my response is to say something like, good for you. I'm so glad you're asking these important questions. Thanks for telling me. Let's talk about it. The first thing I want to do is relieve their fears. Tell them, hey, I care about you. I'm not threatened by your questions. We're in this together. It's okay to ask questions. Now let's go try to find some answers together. I probably get daily emails from people, daily, that say something like this. I'm going through a crisis of faith and I have doubts. Can you Zoom with me so we can talk? Daily. Now, part of me says, why are they reaching out to me? I don't know them. If they had someone in their church who was thoughtful and who cared about them and was the kind of person that invited questions, they should go to that person. Maybe they think I'm safe because I'm kind of a distance away outside of their community, which also communicates something about the fear that we have with doubting. Friends, it's impossible to raise a generation without some questions. You know why? Because of the smartphone. Because of smartphones. There's too much information that is out there to avoid it. Now, by the way, I find the story interesting. In Luke 7:22, John the Baptist had doubts. Now, just stop and think about that. Who is John the Baptist? He's the forerunner of Christ, predicted, prophesied in the Old Testament, related to Jesus, and he has doubts. Now, where and when did he have doubts? In what? In prison. Which tells us when we are emotionally hurting, it oftentimes raises bigger questions. So when I see somebody doubting up here, oftentimes I'm wondering what's the deeper issue and question at play. By the way, how did Jesus respond to this? He answered him, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. What did Jesus say? Jesus reminded them of the evidence that Jesus really is the Messiah. That's why apologetics and truth is so important, is when our emotions go astray. And we say, you know what? I know the Bible's true. I know Jesus claimed to be God. I know he rose from the grave. That helps to anchor us as well. So one big reason people quit running the race of faith is suffering and evil. Paul didn't quit because he counted the cost and he believed Jesus had risen from the grave. The second one is doubts. It's doubts, which raises the question, do we invite and are we okay with questions and are going to be there with young people as they process these questions? That's why Paul said, one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind, straining forward to what lies ahead. Paul is always like, let's move forward. Let's deal with these questions. Third reason is the cultural cost. The cultural cost. Now, we're interestingly at a point now in America where it could cost somebody something to believe in Jesus, especially if you take areas of sexuality seriously. I was speaking with the head of an organization equipping public schools all over Southern California. He said the most common question he gets from teachers regularly is, how do I navigate the gender pronoun use requirement? Do I bow to the law? Is this going to cost me my job? These are real questions that people are asking. Some of you might recognize the name Jack Phillips. Anyone recognize the name Jack Phillips? He was the baker in Colorado who was asked to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. I had a chance to interview him on my YouTube channel. Such a thoughtful, caring person. By the way, he had refused to bake cakes for Halloween because of his convictions. He wouldn't make a pornographic cake. And although he would gladly serve gay people, he would not use his artistic endeavors to make a cake, which he views as a celebration of a certain behavior. He actually told me, he said, when there was a big local story on his cake, they actually said in the news, they said, cakes are not just about matter, they're expressing ideas, they're pieces of art. So he argued that his cakes are a matter of free speech because that's what art is. Yet he was sued by the not California, although I wouldn't be surprised if California sued him as well, by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, who compared him to a Nazi and a perpetrator of the Holocaust. It was his dad or his granddad who served in World War II against the Nazis. He got a call shortly after this on his phone when the story broke, and they said, "We are 10 minutes away from killing you." I mean, threats on his life. There's a lot of people today looking out there going, I don't know if this cost is worth it. You might recognize the name Jaylene Hinkle. For a while, she was one of the best left backs in U.S. soccer. She made the Olympic team. Well, what their team was being forced to do was to wear rainbow flag jerseys. I've gotten multiple questions from Christians. What do I do? Now, that's a tough question, isn't it? But there's this sense of like, how do I navigate this cost to my faith? How do I navigate this? Now, in her case, she actually said she wasn't going to cost her spot on the national team. And she said effectively, if this is why God has raised me up to play soccer, to teach other Christians to be obedient, then so be it. What a powerful Daniel-like experience. It's powerful. But I'm convinced many Christians, when it starts costing us something, and our beliefs run up against the beliefs of culture, they check out. They check out. Now, on the flip side, are there many people in what's called the ex-evangelical movement who have been hurt by Christians? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. It can go both ways. Almost, not always, in almost every story of somebody who's left the faith, there's some kind of mistreatment or abuse or pain at the hands of Christians. So we've got to do some internal soul work to look at and say, have we contributed to this? How do we love people better? But even with that said, we must be willing not to compromise biblical truth, even if it costs us something. Peter wrote this in Acts 5:29. When they were being threatened and being beaten, Peter said, they said, just stop preaching Jesus. And he answered, we won't do it. We must obey God rather than men. I think some people stop running the race of faith because they start to fear human beings more than they fear God. Right? Jesus said, fear the one who can't just kill the body, but the body and the soul into hell. So far, we've seen 3 reasons. Number one, people stop running the race of faith because of evil and because of suffering is a big reason. A second reason is because of doubts and questions. A third reason is the cultural cost. We start fearing human beings and their opinions more than we do God. But Paul says what? One thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. And the last one we'll look at, and then we'll see what questions you might have, I think it's because of sin. Maybe as much or more than any of the reasons, people stop running the race of faith because of sin. My suspicion is that there's some of you in this room who are flirting with certain sins. That if you open up the door and let the camel's nose in just the slightest bit, it will snowball and at some point lead to an avalanche that'll wreck your faith. Ironically, at breakfast, we were talking about Solomon. We're having a great conversation about Solomon. And Solomon, the wisest man or human being who's ever lived. If you read the story of Solomon, the seeds are planted early in his life, even in 1 Kings chapter 3, about the number of wives he begins to have early in his life, that eventually, I would argue, was a huge piece that pulled his heart away from the Lord. So many times when we see somebody fade years later, it's a door they opened up with sin early on that just grew and grew and grew and sidetracks them. I was speaking at a Christian event, won't describe which one it was, and a young man came up to me afterwards. He said, "You really enjoyed this presentation where I do this atheist role play. I pretend to be an atheist, invite questions, and interact with the audience. It's pretty fun." And he came up to me and goes, "Hey, can we talk?" He goes, "I'm actually at this Christian event, but I'm an atheist." I said, "Sure." So we went outside, and we just kind of sat down on these couches. He was probably 18 years old. And I said, "Hey, what's going on?" He goes, "Well, I just recently have stopped believing in God." And I said, "Why?" He started giving me all these reasons. And I don't remember exactly what they were, but I think it was like there's contradictions in the Bible, and Hinduism is older than Christianity anyways, and science. And after listening to him for a few minutes, I sat there and I thought, I just have a hard time believing that this is really what's hijacking the faith of this young man. So I said to him, I said, "Look, I could be mistaken. So I apologize if I am. But I have a sense that we're not talking about the heart of the issue, why you're no longer a Christian." I said, "I suspect something's deeper going on. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But if it is, let's talk about that." I said, "What's going on?" He kind of goes, "Yeah, you're right. This isn't the heart of it." He goes, "I grew up in a conservative fundamentalist home. And I'm going to a public school this fall. And I signed up for a fraternity." Then he paused and he said, "I just want to have fun for a season in life." I said, "Thank you. Now we're talking, aren't we?" This isn't about apparent contradictions in the Bible. That's downstream for you. That's justification of what your heart wants to do. Like we talked about yesterday, he had a faulty view of freedom. Thought the Christian worldview is restricting his freedom. That's a very different conversation, isn't it? I said, "You know what? Realize a couple things. Number one, no matter how far you go down that road, it's always turn around and God is right there and will always forgive you. Don't forget that. God will always forgive you like the prodigal son coming home. But second, you can make your choices, but you also get to live with the consequences of your choices. That's the way life works. I'm not telling you to threaten you. I'm telling you to warn you because choices have consequences. We can choose our choices, but we can't choose the consequences of our choices. And he walked away. Philippians 3 says, "Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly. And they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things." Friends, we're in the middle of a moment. I get emails daily. I'm actually writing another book on this coming out not till next year about this movement of deconstruction, about kids questioning their faith and many leaving it. And we need to make some serious changes in our family, changes in our church, and changes in our relationships, how we pass on the faith to the next generation. We need to be willing to talk about why there's suffering and evil in the world from a biblical perspective. We need to create cultures okay with questions and okay with doubts. We need to realize there is a cost to following Jesus and equip this generation to navigate challenges to their faith from the perspective of their faith. And even when this generation makes decisions we don't want to, our job is to love them nonetheless. Let me end with this last line, and it's 11 o'clock. Perfect. We'll open up for questions. A friend of mine had his teenage daughter start to question her faith and make certain life decisions about her sexuality and identity that just grieved him the way it would any father. And he struggled with it for a while. And he told me, he said, Sean, things changed when I realized my job was not to convince my daughter of an argument, but to convince her of my love. I thought that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit more tomorrow what that looks like. But right now, I'm curious. Questions, thoughts about the larger deconstruction movement, kids disengaging their faith. Something I shared, something I didn't share. Something from this passage that might be helpful to you. Well, I get some water. Can you think of any other reasons why? Yeah, go ahead. So from a practical standpoint, how do you create an environment in which questions are welcome and okay? It's a great question, by the way. I'm going to talk about it a little bit this way in the family tomorrow, but it involves a few things. Number one is when somebody has questions, the way we respond communicates a lot. Rather than showing fear or defensiveness or anger, responding in a way that invites engagement. That's one thing. But I think it starts before that. It's the way we talk about theology. It's the way we talk about life. It's the way we talk about our faith. I was speaking with these Mormons one time at BYU, and I said, hey, I'm really curious. How certain are you that you're right? They look at each other, they look at me, they're like, 100%. And they honestly thought saying 100% was like this great testimony to me of how bold their faith is. I don't remember how to respond, but I was like, wow, so you've never even had questions about your faith? That actually discourages me from taking your perspective seriously. That doesn't strike me as honest at all. I don't think they expect me to say that. So when we talk about like our faith as if we've never had questions and it's simple and just read the Bible, there's the answer, I'm not sure life is that simple. So are we modeling like what it means to wrestle through ideas and to not give simple answers? Because that's how life is. That's how life is. So, it's okay to say to a young person, you know what, that's a great question. I got to think about that for a while. Say, you know what, I don't have an answer to that. Yesterday, I was interviewing Paul Copan, who's an expert on difficult passages in the Old Testament. And there's some tough passages. Like Exodus 21, you can beat a slave. I think it's Deuteronomy 22. Does it command somebody to marry their rapist? Now, if you've just read that and be like, oh, there's easy answers to this, you haven't really wrestled with it. Now, I think there's good answers, but there's some times we have to admit that's pretty tough. I'm not sure. Here's a couple different options. This one makes the most sense to me, but I'm not certain. And you know what? That's an honest response of somebody who really wrestles with tough issues of the faith. So, number one, make sure we don't just communicate things are simple. We've got an answer for everything, and it's easy, and that we shame doubt, and just invite people into the confidence we have in our faith. But that asking questions is a part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And that's okay. That gives permission to this generation. So I think in our sermons, in our relationships with our kids, on every level, we just got to do a little self-reflection and ask how we approach things. Now, I'm not saying we don't have confidence. I'm confident the Christian worldview is true, but I still have questions. And sometimes it's hard to live it. Sometimes I have doubts. Does that answer your question? It was a great question. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So being a lay person, I've never gone to seminary, never been trained, but I struggle when I'm teaching my junior hires with the fact that there's so much information out there, and that if I'm, preparing a lesson, that I could get overwhelmed with just like, there's so much information out there, I'm going to miss something. I guess, so I struggle with just being able to stick with simple truths, my love for the kids, but then, I love the idea that, about creating that welcoming environment of questions, and I think, but, if I want to point the kids to certain resources, there's just so much out there.
Of course. Yep.
That's for me.
Well, first off, thanks for teaching junior hires. Lord bless you. I used to teach high school freshmen. That was like junior high plus. And sometimes we talk about evolution. They're like, yeah, those evolutionists, they're idiots. Like things are black and white in some ways. I'm like, no, they're not. Let's look at this. So here's my basic approach. You need to, because some people are watching. She said, wrestles with teaching junior hires. There's so much information out there. What do you give and what do you not give? When it's all said and done, here's the most important thing that you do for your junior hires. Number one, you just love on them, and I'm confident you're doing that. Number two, you just teach them how to ask good questions and beginning, how do you think theologically about this? How do we think Christianly about this? And then you model going back to the scriptures. Like even teaching through high school and college, even in my grad classes on the resurrection, I'll tell my students, hey, there's going to be other objections about the resurrection we don't talk about. So if I taught them why we believe the resurrection is true, have I taught them how to process tough questions, then when they arise, they don't freak out. And I don't pretend like I've answered every single objection that ever arises. No, because especially with smartphones, kids are going to see something that you haven't trained them. So love on them and just teach them as best you can and say to them, hey, there's even further stuff than we've asked. You might get on TikTok and hear new objections we didn't talk about. Don't freak out. If you see something, bring it to me and we'll talk about it. Or you can do that. But your job, don't feel like you have to give them all the answers. This doesn't rest entirely on you. If you're just loving them, and whatever the topic is, let's see what Scripture says, modeling the authority and importance of Scripture, and having conversation with them, you are doing your job. Now, what we're going to see tomorrow is the most, statistically, hands down, the biggest influence on a young person is not a Sunday school teacher. It's not Netflix. It's not a public school teacher. It's mom and dad, hands down. So you are to support them, but mom and dad play the biggest role. All the studies show this, period. But sure, my resources are out there. I actually think one of the most helpful things today is not to say, hey, here's 50 websites for somebody, but here's 3. Here's 2 good podcasts. Here's 2 good YouTube channels that are trustworthy, good content. That's more valuable than 50. in my estimation? Good question. Others, yeah, please.
Yeah, so talking about parents, the influence of parents, which I think is critical. Do you think one of the reasons that young people leave the faith is because we are training our children, we're raising our children to focus on the worldview of their life, the purpose of their life, getting a good profession, getting a good job, instead of focusing on serving the Lord as their purpose. So once they reach college, once they have gone to good schools, once they have get their professions, that's where they're supposed to be, because that's the way we raise them up, right? They're supposed to reach that worldview of how they should live their life, instead of saying, I'm doing this to serve God. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great question. I'm going to tip my hat because I'm going to start my talk tomorrow with an example. Working at a Christian school in San Juan Capistrano, 20 years, 10 times full-time, 10 years full-time, 10 years part-time. And I'll ask my students a question. More than anything else, what do your parents want for you? And they'll say, my parents just want me to be happy or successful. Well, that's a certain worldview, isn't it? And so their time and their conversations and their energy is about you being happy and you being successful. That's a kind of gospel that we're preaching and living and emphasizing it. So in some sense, if that's what we're pressing on our kids, why would we expect them to believe and live differently? But we don't realize that we're doing that. I'd rather have my kids be miserable failures in the eyes of the world and following Jesus than happy and successful and not. And it's hard. I mean, there's a lot of money near where I live in Orange County. You told me a friend sold a house for $2.5 million. There's a lot of money around here. And we can easily get caught up in those secondary priorities and lose what matters most. So it starts with, it's really going to be my talk tomorrow. It's one of my favorite talks. The second one is, it starts with us looking in the mirror and examining our own lives. Because if our lives are about happiness and success, our kids are going to listen to what we do, not to what we say. So I think you're right on. Let's maybe do one more, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, all the way in the back. Go.
So how do we show that we love the person, yet we don't agree with their choices of like transgender? I don't want it to like appear like I've accepted their choice of being the opposite, but yet I want to show that I've loved them.
Here's what I would say. That, first off, that is perhaps the most common kind of question I'm asked today. Living in this tension between truth and love. And we can err on one side over the other. I don't have it all figured out in every circumstance exactly how to do that. I would be lying if I said, here's the formula, bam. When it comes to the issue of transgender, and somebody, for example, says, hey, please use this preferred pronoun for me. What I think a Christian could do, number one, is you can pretty much assume that anybody who's transgender knows as a whole where Christians stand. There's no surprise about that. So I'm going to say, you know what? I would love to hear your story. Would you be willing over coffee, over a meal, over a walk, just to tell me about yourself? And my only agenda is to listen and understand. My dad said to me multiple times, I think I shared this yesterday, it's more important to understand than to be understood. The Bible has a lot to say about listening before we speak. Sometimes love is just listening and understanding. But sometimes we don't do this as Christians because we feel like that's affirmation, don't we? But it's not. So I would go to that person and say, hey, would you be, I want to hear your story. I want to hear how you became you. And I just say, tell me about your family growing up. What'd you love to do? Tell me about your parents. What were your hobbies? Where'd you go to school? Who's your favorite teacher? Hey, would you be willing to share the first time you felt gender dysphoria? How did people treat you? What were helpful things people did? What were unhelpful things? Did it shape the way you think about God? How did Christians treat you? Why is it so important that I call you by this preferred pronoun? I just want to understand. That's a powerful act of love that doesn't involve compromising biblical truth. Then you can be in a position with this person to say something like, do you feel like I've understood where you're coming from? That's really my goal. Do you feel like I've been empathetic? Yeah. Are you curious about my experience and how I think about issues like gender? Now, if they say no, then move on. They're not open. You can't force anybody, right? But if you've just shown that much love and compassion, they might. And then you could say, you know what, walk through your life, whatever, and at the end you can say, here's how I think about gender because I think the Bible's true. Just like you are committed to being yourself, I am in the same way. And asking me to use a pronoun that I think misrepresents who you are is asking me not to be true to myself. Do you want me to not be true to myself? Like, honestly, I'd say, here's the deal. We kind of have a point of tension, don't we? I want to be in a relationship with you. I want to care for you. But I also don't want to feel like I'm being unfaithful to Jesus. Can we figure this out together? I mean, if somebody says no, I don't know what else you could do to show charity and kindness and care to that person. I don't know what else you could do. Now, I have some Christian friends who are like, sure, I'm happy to use a preferred pronoun, doesn't bother me. I'm not quite in that camp. I'm not in that camp for a few reasons. But if you're there, fine, that's between you and the Lord. That's what I would try to do. Does that make sense? I'm always trying to think through, how can I lead with charity? Because the Bible says it's a soft word that breaks a bone. A gentle word turns away wrath. It's your kindness that leads to repentance. And I'm going to talk about this in my cancel culture talk tomorrow. I think if we just ask ourselves, if I put myself in that person's shoes, how do I show love to that person? How do I show kindness to that person? How do I meet that person where they're at? I think we would approach these conversations differently. And we can do that in a way without compromising truth. That's my general approach. I lied. One more question. Go.
If you have an organization, a school, or government that's forcing you to use those pronouns, at what point do you not become a Peterson or something like that?
Well, I think you go to something like ADF, Alliance for Defending Freedom. So when I was talking with the head of schools in Southern California, he said Alliance Defending Freedom is waiting for these kind of cases to make a precedence for it. And so I think there is, especially with the Supreme Court right now, there's very good reason that religious liberty would, in fact, be preserved. So, look, this might be easy for me to say, but a co-author friend of mine said we need to develop a theology of getting fired. So first off, make sure we're dying on the right hills. But if a government-sponsored organization is going to require somebody to use a preferred pronoun, I have massive free speech issues with that, not to mention moral issues with that. And frankly, Jack Phillips was sued, won in the Supreme Court, sued, won, and last I checked, still in a third case. It has embroiled his business for a decade. Even though people could walk like 2 minutes down the road and find another baker that would make a cake for a same-sex wedding. I mean, he has taken one for the team, I think you could say. And as Christians, at some point, we need to say, stop, I'm not going any further. But the model for this, let me end with this. I actually start my book, A Rebel's Manifesto, with this because I think it's kind of timely. Is Daniel's told in Daniel chapter 1 just eat the king's food and drink the king's wine. Now, can you imagine how much justification Daniel could have had for that? Man, I have just this favor with the king, my family, I'm taken care of, great education, it's just food. Well, what does Daniel say? Because the food wasn't kosher. He determined in his heart not to defile himself. But then he came up with a creative solution, the vegetable diet, that would give the king what he really wanted, which wasn't about the food, and Daniel could keep his conscience. That's a brilliant model. Now we see in the rest of Daniel that sometimes it's bow down or die. But sometimes we don't think through these practical, wise, careful steps and just jump to dying on certain hills. I'm thinking, let's use wisdom. Let's use understanding and every option we have first. But then if it's required, there are certain hills we need to die on. So a friend of mine asked me if they were, baking cakes, should you bake cakes for a same-sex wedding? And a creative solution somebody told me is just, why don't you put a sign on the wall that says we bake cakes for same-sex weddings? All the proceeds go to folks in the family. It doesn't necessarily fix everything, but that's a pretty creative way. That's the kind of creativity we need to navigate prayerfully some of these circumstances. That's in the book of Rebels Manifesto. It's all about having conversations with young people. You know what the studies show? Here's a formula I'm going to talk about tomorrow. You want a kid to accept the faith? Number one, you have to live it. Number two, build relationships with kids. And number three, have meaningful spiritual conversations. If you had to give it a formula, that's what it would be. So I wrote this book in particular to help parents have spiritual conversations with their kids and their grandkids. Again, short chapters about some of the most contentious issues of our day, so they can just start to think the Bible applies to this. There's a way to think Christianly about this, and my faith can be lived out there. That's the book of Rebels Manifesto. The one book is God, Human Invention. I didn't mention this yesterday, but these are the top 17 issues, like why does God allow evil? What about hell? Does evolution disprove God? These kinds of big questions, apologetic questions we answer there. And then tomorrow I'm going to talk about the book so the next generation will know. This is written for parents, grandparents. How do we practically pass on our faith to kids? So this is more of a how-to book with practical ideas to do this. So if that's helpful, they will be back there. Do we have one more song? You never told me when we're supposed to close out. I hope I didn't go too long this morning. One more song. I'll be back there after we're done for about 15 minutes. I promised my wife I'd be back. We got a ton of family stuff we're doing. I can't speak on reaching kids and not get back to my family. So when you're done, if you want a book, come grab one really quickly, and then we'll see you Sunday morning. All right? Thank you.